If a U.S. Army sergeant can vanish right in the middle of a well-lit intersection, then what else has been happening that we've never been told? On the night of December 20th, 1987, the main street in Marina, California, lay quiet. Cold ocean winds swept in, carrying the scent of salt and a thin mist. A military vehicle stopped at a red light. In the blink of an eye, the passenger opened the door, stepped out, and disappeared into the darkness. No one saw him run. No one heard a cry for help. And for the next 2 years, the Army listed him as a deserter. His name was Jeff Coonrot. 37 years have passed, yet his family still keeps an empty seat at the holiday table. But that night, who was with him? And why, to this day, do we still not know the truth? You're listening to Hidden Echoes, where the missing and forgotten are brought back into the light. Not to deliver final answers, but to make sure the questions don't fade into silence. Jeff Allen Coonrot was born in 1960 in Ballston Spa, a small town in upstate New York where winters buried the streets under thick snow and summers brought neighbors together at the local baseball field to cheer for the town's youth team. Ballston Spa wasn't wealthy, but it was a tight-knit place, the kind of town where you knew the milkman's name and your elementary school teacher's face. The Coonrot family lived in a white-painted wooden house on the edge of town, with a porch where an old rocking chair sat, the spot where Jeff's mother liked to spend her afternoons. His father was a mechanic, his hands rough and stained with oil, yet every evening he still found time to help his son fix up an old bike or teach him how to hold a baseball bat. Jeff was the oldest child, and though he never said it aloud, he felt responsible for protecting his younger sister and his mother, especially when his father worked late. Neighbors remembered him as a polite boy, always ready to carry groceries for the elderly woman at the end of the street or clear snow from the driveway for older residents. These memories of Jeff would be shared again years later, long after his name was spoken only in quiet conversations over coffee at the town diner. Back in his teenage years, no one imagined Jeff would one day leave this place for faraway lands, wear the uniform of the U.S. Army, and vanish from their lives like a cold winter wind. In 1979, at 19, Jeff joined the United States Army. It was a decision that felt both surprising and somehow fitting. He told friends he wanted to see the world and do something meaningful, though some believed he was searching for a new direction, a challenge to push himself beyond his limits. After completing basic training, Jeff was stationed at several bases before arriving at Fort Ord, California. There, he quickly earned the trust of his fellow soldiers and superiors, known for taking on tough assignments and never quitting halfway. Teammates described him as quiet but steadfast. If he gave his word, he kept it. And Jeff wasn't the stereotypical cold soldier people imagined. He kept the habit of sending letters and postcards home. Some even had little doodles, a smiley face, or the words "still safe," small reassurances for his family. By December 1987, Jeff had served nearly 9 years, long enough to know the hidden corners of military life, yet still holding firm to the belief that honor was something you could never surrender. Even so, friends noticed that in the weeks before he went missing, Jeff spoke less, and there was a weight in his eyes, a worry he never put into words. To his family, Jeff was more than a soldier. He was their anchor. His sister Yvonne recalled that whenever Jeff came home, on leave he would bring gifts for everyone, even if it was just a keychain or a small notebook. He paid attention to the smallest details, remembering the birthday of an old neighbor and sending a card. Yet just a week before he vanished, Yvonne received a call from Jeff. His voice was quieter than usual, assuring her that everything's fine, but asking more than usual about everyone's health. When Yvonne pressed him about what was going on, Jeff paused for a few seconds before saying he'd tell her later. That was the last time the family ever heard his voice. On that same day, according to one fellow soldier, Jeff had a private conversation with his commanding officer. The content of that discussion was never made public. From that day forward, Jeff stopped joining group gatherings and spent more time alone in his room. What puzzled everyone was that he left behind all his personal belongings, including his wallet and an identification, as if he had no plan to leave. And that detail would later become one of the biggest questions when his disappearance was re-examined. If Jeff had intended to run away, why leave everything behind? December 20th, 1987 began like any other day at Fort Ord. Winter in California carried a damp chill with a light fog draped over the rows of trees near the barracks. Jeff was seen that morning leaving his room to go about his usual duties. His fellow soldiers recalled that he didn't seem anxious or restless, yet his eyes still held that quiet, heavy look they'd noticed in the weeks before. By midday, Jeff had lunch at the base dining hall with a few friends, speaking less than usual. No one realized it would be one of the last times they'd ever see him. Around 6 p.m., he left his room in a neatly pressed uniform, wearing a green winter jacket. He carried no backpack, no wallet, and nothing personal, just his familiar white Nike sneakers. One soldier later said Jeff had plans to go somewhere with another serviceman, the same man who would become the only key witness in this story. About an hour later, the two were spotted leaving the base in a green military vehicle. What Jeff didn't know, or perhaps knew but chose not to say, was that this drive would not bring him back. According to the driver, who was also Jeff's colleague, they passed through the quiet coastal town of Marina. When the vehicle stopped at a red light, he claimed, Jeff suddenly opened the passenger door and stepped out. Jeff said nothing. He simply left the seat and walked off toward the left side of the road. On the surface, this account sounded straightforward. But from the very beginning, there were details that made both the family and certain investigators doubt the story. If Jeff intended to run away, why step out at a dark intersection with nothing on him? And why didn't the driver try to find out where he was going or report it immediately? It was roughly 9 p.m. The streets were empty, lit only by the amber glow of streetlights on damp pavement. Marina was a small town, and at that hour most shops were closed. No witnesses came forward to say they'd seen Jeff, apart from the driver's testimony, leaving the story shrouded in uncertainty. The vehicle drove on, leaving behind a blank space and the timeline that has never been filled in more than 30 years. Perhaps the most striking thing after that night was the reaction, or rather the lack of reaction, from the Army. Jeff was not immediately reported as missing. Instead, his file was marked AWOL, absent without leave, a term that implied he had walked away from his post. That decision stalled any search efforts for nearly 2 years, until the Army officially changed his status to missing. During that time, his family never stopped calling, writing letters, and pleading for information. The answers they received were vague, offering no real clarity. There was no large-scale search in the days following Jeff's disappearance. Local police were never brought in at the level they should have been, partly because it was assumed the Army would handle a soldier's case internally. By the time the public finally heard about Jeff's case, any early leads had long gone cold. The white Nike sneakers, the green winter jacket, the image of a soldier stepping down from the passenger seat at a lonely intersection all became scattered, fragments in the memory of just one man. And it is within that vast silence, the absence of answers, that countless questions have taken root, questions that have never been answered. When the Army finally launched an official investigation, it relied almost entirely on the account of the soldier who had driven Jeff that night. In his report, he claimed Jeff simply stepped out of the vehicle at an intersection and disappeared into the dark. There was no mention of Jeff carrying any belongings, no explanation for why he would leave mid-ride, and no evidence to support the story beyond his word. The family repeatedly asked, why didn't the driver circle back to look for him immediately? Why wasn't an urgent report filed that very night? Those questions seemed to vanish into a void, never receiving a clear answer. In meetings with investigators, Yvonne recalled they often sidestepped the details of that ride as if there was something they couldn't or wouldn't say. All information about the driver, his connection to Jeff, and the true purpose of their trip remained under wraps. That lack of transparency left a gaping hole in the story, one that over time became filled with rumor and suspicion. One of the strangest aspects of the case was the near total absence of physical evidence. The white Nike sneakers Jeff wore that night were never found. A gas station near the intersection reportedly had security cameras that might have captured something, but when questioned, the Army said the system had been out of order that night. A resident living nearby claimed to have seen a man in a uniform walking along the highway close to midnight, but could not confirm it was Jeff. Investigators found no clear footprints, no clothing, no personal items at the scene. This was especially unusual given that the area wasn't large, and in 1987, Marina was a quiet town. The family went there themselves, searching for any trace, only to find an empty stretch of road, the dim glow of streetlights, and the sound of the ocean in the distance. The fact that all physical traces seemed to vanish so quickly led many to believe the answer did not lie in Unsolved, Jeff deciding to walk away on his own, but in something that happened swiftly and with deliberate secrecy that night. 3 decades later, a former soldier who had been stationed at Fort Ord in 1987 reached out to Yvonne. He told her that at the time of Jeff's disappearance, there had been quiet tensions within the base, incidents that were never written into official records. He did not make any direct accusations, but suggested that Jeff may have known something certain people didn't want exposed. This detail could not be verified, but it opened a new possibility that Jeff's disappearance was not a sudden impulse, but the result of a chain of events quietly unfolding long before that night. When investigators revisited the case and spoke to this witness, they noticed that parts of his timeline did not match the original account given by the driver. That raised a new question. If the very first statement wasn't entirely accurate, how much more truth had been left out? Yvonne remembered that moment in an interview. I don't know who's right or who's wrong. I just know one thing. There are people who know the Fawcett Childs truth, and they've chosen to stay silent. From there, the story began to turn in an entirely new direction. One where nothing could be taken for granted, and every theory had to be reconsidered from the beginning. 35 years after Jeff vanished, the case took a sharp turn when the Army CID released several partially declassified documents. Buried in those faded pages was a short note indicating that Jeff had reported an incident to his superiors just days before his disappearance. The details were blacked out, but the remaining text revealed he had asked for the conversation to remain confidential. That single line immediately raised the question, was that incident directly connected to Jeff's disappearance? His family had never heard this before. When Yvonne read it, she described the feeling as if a door locked for 3 decades had finally creaked open, only to reveal a pitch-black hallway. Investigators explained that the record came from the base's internal files stored under personnel concerns. No one could say for certain what it referred to, but the timing was difficult to ignore. A soldier about to enter his 9th year of service disappears just days after reporting something sensitive. From that moment, a new question emerged. Who heard Jeff's words, and what did they do afterward? The only person who admitted to being with Jeff in his final known moments was the driver that night. For years, he maintained he had no idea where Jeff went and had no involvement in his disappearance. But when investigators revisited his personnel file, they found that he had once been the subject of an internal probe for violent behavior toward another soldier, though the incident never resulted in formal discipline. Several former Fort Ord servicemen recalled his short temper and even mentioned a minor confrontation between him and Jeff a few weeks before the disappearance. No one could confirm that this was the cause of anything, but it cast his original account in a new, more suspicious light. When investigators tried to reach him for a follow-up interview, his response was curt. He refused to discuss the matter further. For Jeff's family, these revelations were both infuriating and heartbreaking. They understood the truth might never fully surface. But these gaps, these silences, only made the pain harder to bear. When all the new details were placed side by side, a different picture began to form. Jeff reporting something important days before he vanished. The driver, with a history of aggression and a disappearance, unfolding in the shadows of a deserted intersection. It all felt like pieces of a chain leading toward a tragic end, but still missing the one link that could explain everything. Someone knows, and for 37 years, they have chosen to keep it to themselves. For Yvonne, that is the hardest part to accept. If someone saw something, or heard something, or even just knows a piece of the truth, why won't they speak? Jeff was a person. You can't just erase someone from the world like that. Her words cut through like an indictment against decades of silence. And as the investigation entered its newest phase, with sharper questions aimed at that one fellow soldier, it felt as though the case might be inching closer to an answer, but also toward truths far more difficult to them to face than anyone had ever imagined. In 1996, nearly 9 years after Jeff disappeared, a search team stumbled upon a pair of white sneakers in a sparse patch of forest near the Marina coastline. By then, the shoes were weathered and brittle, the fabric dulled with dust, the laces frayed to threads. Some said they looked exactly like the Nikes Jeff often wore, but no clear proof ever linked them to him. The Army logged the find, yet whatever testing may have been done was never publicly released. Years later, when the case was reopened, Yvonne asked about the sneakers. The only response she got was, "They have no investigative value." What made it even stranger was the location, roughly 3 miles from the intersection where Jeff was last seen. If they truly were his, how did they end up there after so many years? The shoes became an emblem of the case, an ordinary object carrying an extraordinary weight of unanswered questions, a fragile symbol of the family's thin but stubborn hope that other missing pieces might still be found. When Army CID partnered with the Vidocq Society to reinvestigate, an anonymous tip arrived, a map of the coastal woods, marked with a single red dot. The sender claimed it was where you should look. All search teams swept the area, but found nothing except a few decayed scraps of cloth too far gone to identify. The lead produced no breakthrough, but it raised a different question. Who sent the map, and how did they know that spot? Investigators tried to trace the sender, but hit a dead end at a local post office that had processed the tip anonymously. That only deepened the sense that this case was a puzzle scattered across many hands, each holding a piece, each with their own private motives. With every fact contradicted or left unverified, one unsettling realization emerged. No one in the story could be fully trusted, not the fellow soldier, not the witnesses, and maybe not even the supposed helpful informants. For Yvonne, the endless cycle of shifting theories became both exhausting and paralyzing. Every new lead brought a flicker of hope, only for that hope to collapse, tearing the wound open all over again. She once believed that one day the truth would appear, clear and undeniable, like light at the end of a tunnel. But the deeper she went into the case, the further that light seemed to retreat, swallowed by a thick darkness of contradictions, silence, and secrecy. When a reporter asked if she still believed any version of the story, Yvonne only shook her head. "I believe he's gone. Everything else, I'm not sure anymore." That moment captured the case's crisis of faith, the point where no person, no account could be clung to as an absolute truth. And it's here that we see the disappearance of Jeff Coonrot for what it truly is, not only the story of a man who vanished, but of the empty spaces left behind, spaces carved out by time, silence, and fear. 37 years have passed since the night Jeff Coonrot vanished at that intersection in Marina. In that time, the soldiers who once served beside him have retired, moving on to new chapters in their lives. The town where Jeff grew up has changed. Small shops have been replaced by modern cafes, and the baseball field has been renovated. But for those who knew him, the old story remains, shared on summer afternoons or in the long quiet of winter evenings. In Yvonne's home, a small table by the window still holds Jeff's photograph. The picture has faded, its wooden frame chipped at the edges, yet the eyes looking out are as clear as ever. Each holiday season, his chair at the table remains empty, a quiet reminder that the family has never given up hope for answers. Yvonne no longer searches for a complete resolution. She knows this case may never close in the way people expect, but she believes in one thing, that his name, his story, and his existence cannot be erased. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in the form of a verdict or a guilty party. Sometimes it is simply the world remembering and acknowledging that someone was here, that they lived, and that they loved. Today's younger investigators bring fresh technology and new perspectives to the case, but they still face a wall of silence that has stood for decades. Each question risks vanishing into that void, and each new clue reveals only a fragment of the truth. Jeff's disappearance is no longer just an unresolved entry in a military file. It has become part of the personal history of those who loved him, a mark that time cannot erase. Somewhere out there, someone may still know what happened, but they are either not ready or unwilling to speak. And the possibility that such a person exists is what keeps the story from ever truly ending. As the late afternoon light filters through Yvonne's window, she sits by Jeff's photograph, her hand resting gently on the dusty glass. She whispers, almost to herself, "You never disappeared from my heart." That is the final message this story leaves behind. That sometimes, to keep a person alive, all you have to do is refuse to let them be forgotten. If you've stayed with us through this journey, you now know the story of Jeff Coonrod, a sergeant, a brother, a son, a friend, who disappeared on a cold December night in 1987, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. We may never know the full truth, but we know one thing. He existed, he lived, and he was loved. Maybe one day, someone will break the silence. Maybe the answer is still out there, waiting for the right moment to be found. But until that day comes, there is one thing we can all do. We can refuse to let his name fade away. So I'll leave you with this. After hearing this story, what do you think really happened that night? Share your thoughts. You never know. A single detail or perspective might open a new door in this case. And if you believe Jeff deserves to be remembered, leave these simple words: I remember Jeff. It's only 4 words, but sometimes the smallest things can be the loudest echoes against decades of silence.